The first commercial capsule capable of carrying humans docks with the International Space Station. Is this a breakthrough for commercial programs? And will it take space exploration to a new level? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, science fiction has long said space is the next frontier, and this is gradually becoming a reality, it seems. You see, on Saturday, SpaceX made history with the launch of its Dragon spacecraft. The firm is owned by billionaire Ellon Musk. The new space vehicle carried only cargo and a human dummy, but it's become the first American commercial space vehicle designed to carry humans to dock at the International Space Station. The US government ended its famous space shuttle program in 2011. Andy Gallagher sets up our discussion with this report.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition, liftoff.
When SpaceX's unmanned Dragon capsule launched from Cape Canaveral on Saturday, it was a high-stakes mission. 27 hours later, the capsule, with only a test dummy on board, slowly approached the International Space Station. When it successfully docked, NASA and SpaceX declared a new era in commercial space travel.
Capture confirmed.
To be frank, I'm a little emotionally exhausted because that was super stressful, but it worked.
It's been 8 years since American astronauts last launched into space from US soil, but SpaceX hopes to change that. The Dragon capsule will remain in place until Friday, when it undocks and aims for a splashdown in the Atlantic, another vital test for the program. The next mission from SpaceX will be a test of the capsule's high-altitude abort capabilities, a safety system designed to get astronauts out of the way if there's a problem during launch. After that will come the real milestone. In July, SpaceX plans to send 2 astronauts into space, potentially ending years of the US relying on other countries to get humans to the International Space Station. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's have a look now at the history of how commercial companies have explored space. In 1982, a US company called Space Services launched the first privately funded rocket. Then, some 19 years later, American multimillionaire Dennis Tito boarded a Russian capsule and became the world's first ever space tourist. And last year, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic successfully rocketed to the edge of space and back. Let's bring in our guests into the show now. We have joining us from Toronto, Colonel Chris Hadfield. He was the first Canadian commander of the International Space Station, the author of the book An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. In Houston, joining us on Skype, Eric Berger. He's a senior space editor at Ars Technica. And in London, Jill Stewart. She's a research fellow at the London School of Economics who researches the politics, ethics and laws of outer space. Welcome to you all. Exciting panel. If I could start with Eric. So, are you excited, Eric? Is this a huge step forward for space privatization, if we can call it that? How do you feel about that, Eric?
Well, it's not a huge step forward, but it certainly was a critical step. I mean, this mission has to go right if SpaceX is going to launch people into space. That will be the huge and significant moment later this summer, maybe this fall. But this mission really was a proving ground. If they could safely launch the capsule, if it could autonomously dock to the station, which it did on Sunday, and then critically, if it can land later this week on Friday morning in the Atlantic Ocean safely, then they will go a long way to show NASA and the rest of the world that a private company can do something that previously only countries, the United States, Russia, and China have done before.
Let me bring Jill into the discussion. One should not forget, though, this is by no means the beginning of commercial space exploration, right? A lot of what we think of as government programs, at least in the US, involve the private sector. Why is this so significant?
Yeah, I'm glad you had that short lead-in where you talked about the history of commercialization. I think we tend to think of space commercialization as being something that's really new, but it's been going on for decades. And also, something else to point out is that SpaceX has had a lot of government funding backing it. And so I think we can't really distinguish between these being completely separate entities, government versus private. So it is a significant event, but I don't think we should overstate exactly how new it is.
Well, what is significant then, Jill, if, as you said, we've got this long history of the line being blurred between government and private programs?
I would say personally, because the United States is going to have its capability to put humans onto the International Space Station again, even though it's through a commercial partner, but it would be from American soil. Legally, what's interesting is that because it's a commercial entity, a state has to take responsibility, a country has to take responsibility for any damage that might be done by the object, in this case, the Dragon capsule, but it would be the United States that would be responsible for the capsule in this case. So since the space shuttle was retired, it would be the first time that the United States would be space capable again in terms of humans, and that's significant. So it is a big event, but again, I wouldn't want to overstate the degree to which space commercialization is something hugely new. It's more of an evolution in my mind rather than a revolution.
All right, so it's a big event for the US's capabilities of putting humans back in space. Colonel Hadfield, you're a Canadian. You've been in space. You've been a commander at the International Space Station. Is there a reason for those who are not Americans to also be excited about this day?
Yeah, Sami, I think it's incredibly exciting. Not only is this a new vehicle to take human beings off of the Earth, which we haven't had for a while, but it's also set up in a whole different type of management structure so that SpaceX has the option of not just taking American government or other international astronauts to space, but they have the potential of taking kind of whoever they want to space. And Boeing, who's also building a rocket that should fly later this year that can take people on it, has the same option. There are ways to bring passengers up as well. It's like early aviation suddenly opening to passengers being able to get on and see the whole world in a new way. So it's kind of like a door opening that we've never had open before. And I agree with what Jill and Eric just said, but I think it's also just a really cool next development in providing access to space like we've never seen it.
So, Colonel, do you feel like we're witnessing somehow the beginnings of human colonization of space?
Well, it's still very, very early. I mean, it's still dangerous and therefore difficult and expensive. So that becomes a real limiter. But with every launch on these new rockets that SpaceX has built and all of their competitors, it's decreasing the risk and therefore increasing the accessibility, dropping the cost. So yeah, that opens up some real possibilities, not just to getting things much more cheaply to Earth orbit, but the next logical destination being the moon. It's only 3 days away, and it's not that big a shift in technology for people to go to the space station or to get to orbit around the moon or even down to the surface. And rather than just the early exploration days where we just showing at the top of Everest that it was barely possible, to actually get into the phase of human settlement. It seems science fiction, but that's the cusp of where we are. And that's what was really dramatically sort of demonstrated by this first launch of SpaceX's human-rated spaceship.
Well, that's kind of the feeling where we get excited, or we're getting excited about the story, because we kind of feel like we're taking a big step forward. Eric, is there a difference, a distinction that we need to make between a private company working in a government program and the sort of thing that Virgin Galactic is working on, which is very much more towards space tourism, taking people around in space?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about that. First of all, there is a big difference between a government contractor going out and saying we're going to fulfill what the government wants to do, which is get people to the International Space Station, and then there's a purely commercial operation by Virgin Galactic, which is to try and send hundreds of people on suborbital space trips. But I would also say that Jill said that this was an evolution more than a revolution, but I think it is the beginning of a revolution, because for a long time you had government buying products basically from contractors, telling them exactly what they wanted and how to do it. And the government's goal, certainly during the Apollo program and since then, was to send a handful of people into space, the best and the brightest, and to do things. But kind of the new ethos of these commercial companies like SpaceX, Virgin, and Blue Origin is really to shake that up and not kind of have a cadre of elite astronauts like Colonel Hadfield, the best and the brightest, but to broaden access to space more. And you're seeing that with the approach toward reusable rockets, which SpaceX has helped to pioneer in terms of vertical takeoff and landing. And so the fact that this company that is out there saying we want to colonize Mars eventually gets to space first ahead of a legacy aerospace company like Boeing with SpaceX's Dragon capsule really kind of I think puts down a marker for the future that this commercial space world, this broadening access to space, lowering the costs, allowing more people to go to space, that future is possible. We're certainly not there yet. This is very much the beginning of the process.
All right, let's bring Jill back into that point then. Is it more of a revolution than you might be willing to concede, Jill? The feeling that private companies are now becoming more and more involved in the entire process of space exploration than before?
I'm sticking with my word of evolution. I do still think it's more gradual. And something I would point out, I think it's interesting, you mentioned colonization, sort of jump to colonization. Maybe I'm just somebody who tends towards the middle, but I think maybe the middle step really that we're talking about here would be tourism first. So I think it's really interesting to talk about the ethical questions around colonization. But what we saw over the weekend, I think, more points towards what we might see in the next decade, which really is about tourism. One of the things that I think is interesting is, with complete respect to both Eric and Chris, who are very optimistic about this being a positive thing of people being able to go into space, I do think we need to think about, who do we want to be able to have access to space? Is it, definitely a good thing that we can all potentially go out there? What experiences do we want people to be able to get out of this? Should we be thinking about regulations and safety and the environmental impacts of being able to go out there? I actually am optimistic about what the future holds in terms of going up.
But are you suggesting that the framework is not there, Jill?
I think, in terms of regulation for
yeah.
Well, I mean, to some degree, yes. Or at least it's obviously not tested entirely. But I mean, as Chris, I'm sure, could attest to, just the legal infrastructure for the International Space Station was incredibly complicated because of the fact that we were dealing with multiple nationalities, and outer space is a neutral territory in terms of as nation states go. And so I do think we are, to some degree, wading into a legal area that is unprecedented. Would you disagree?
Well, let's bring in Chris. Colonel Hadfield, you've been on the International Space Station, and many of us saw your beautiful video of singing Space Oddity by David Bowie. I think that was on the space station, right? And as you were tossing that guitar around and singing so beautifully. Not many people would say, oh, we need some regulation to control Colonel Hadfield singing Space Oddity in space. But is there perhaps, to your mind, the risk that we do need some regulation to control what other people might want to do in space? It shouldn't be a free-for-all, no pun intended.
Well, yeah, if we're looking for a precedent, when the Wright brothers first flew in 1903, aviation was a free-for-all, sort of like drones have been for the last decade, where there's this new technological capability, and then how is it going to become commercialized and normalized? And at first, it was very much uncontrolled, but governments invested a fortune in developing airplanes through the First World War and then the predecessor to NASA, until eventually airplanes became good enough and safe enough that they got commercialized. And now, last year, I think over 4 billion people flew on commercial airplanes. That's like 11 million people a day. And they're in international airspace and waters, living in a hostile environment. And yet we've found ways to regulate it and to control it, where the captain is the captain of the ship, so they have control within that vehicle, but then everybody is following a certain set of rules on board. They're space travelers of a sort.
Is
They're
this
air
one,
travelers,
Colonel
just not
Hadfield,
quite as
is
up
this
high.
one a
So
little
I
bit
think
different
it's
from
possible to do.
aviation, though, because aviation started off maybe with regulation in a sort of national airspace and then went international, whereas in the case of space, you just delve straight into the international space, if we can call it that, and countries, you know, don't get a chance.
We have experience with that, though. I mean, we've have set up Antarctica kind of as a neutral territory where, you know, no one can own it, and so that kind of provides the legal framework. There's an outer space treaty that is in place. Certainly, much more legal work needs to be done.
Okay, interesting. So would you say, Eric, some of the laws, like, I don't know, the law of the seas and the Antarctica and these things can be applied to space? The same concept?
They can be extended into space. To some extent, they already have. The problem is right now there's no one really there to enforce it. I think the biggest legal test in the near term is going to come in terms of something called space situational awareness, which is basically space debris. And the more satellites and spacecraft and vehicles you get up into orbit, the greater chance you have of collisions and creating a real problem of orbital debris.
Well, hang on, Eric. I thought that was one of the treaties that allows the UN to regulate that stuff, or at least register who puts what up where.
It does, but as you get more stuff up there, you have greater chances of debris. And so you're going to need very smart regulation and very smart tracking of that. And we've seen some efforts in the United States and elsewhere to do that, but that is kind of the great challenge over the next 10 years, I think, from a legal standpoint.
Well, let's bring in our legal expert on this, Jill.
It's absolutely the case that sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
It's absolutely the case that there is a legal infrastructure to govern space debris and specifically the liability. So any damage that is caused by space debris gets allocated, the money, the cost of it gets allocated to the state that is responsible for launching the object. But the problem is tracking it and controlling it. And I'm sure Chris probably has some experience of, you know, worrying about debris on the International Space Station, for example.
I wonder if we take it back to Colonel
I think we forget the Earth gets hit by 40 tons of meteorites every single day. You know, just natural debris coming from the universe. So living on board the space station, if you sat and waited quietly for a few minutes, you could hear small meteorites ricocheting or bouncing off the hull of the ship. It's a relatively hostile environment. And what Eric and Jill are talking about, of course, the man-made particles up there just add to that risk. So it's a hostile place to be. We need to regulate our own contributions to that. We have the Outer Space Treaty, which lays the initial groundwork, but it was signed back in 1967, and it needs to be updated and ratified with everybody that's going. It's a process, and almost always the legality gets in behind the technology. The technology leads out front. So we have a lot of legal work to do, but I don't think we're going to stop to technology or people's natural curiosity and excitement at traveling to what was otherwise just a science fiction destination.
That sounds quite scary, Colonel Hadfield, sitting in your space station and hearing debris smashing into you. Of course, you are part of a project that I guess you could say symbolizes international cooperation. I wonder whether you're concerned at all that this could prompt more sort of competition rather than international cooperation. Let's not forget, space also has its military uses and purposes.
Well, there's nothing wrong with, nothing wrong with I agree with you, Sami. There's nothing wrong with competition. I mean, it brings out the best, though sometimes the worst of us also. But I think the International Space Station is a tremendous example, lasting almost 30 years now, of how we can work together when we're trying to tackle something really complex. I mean, Russia and the United States and Japan and Germany and England, all of those countries have worked hand in glove, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week since the early 90s on the International Space Station. And as we're headed towards the moon next, those same partners and adding other partners from the other newer space agencies are looking at how we can use that as a regulatory framework for becoming an interplanetary species. And I think that's a really good foundation to build on. But you're right, we have to be very careful, especially when we discover something valuable on the moon or when we look at the military advantages of the high ground. We have to try and put all those things together. It's fraught with peril, but it's also a magnificent opportunity.
It is fraught with peril. I want to bring Eric into this and ask, what difference does, shall we say, advanced commercialization of space make to the concept, the worry, or the opportunity of increased militarization of space?
Right, that's an excellent question, and I totally agree with Colonel Hadfield. You've got the civil use of space, which was NASA's exploration programs and the like, and the International Space Station, which has been a tremendous success from that standpoint. And then you've got military space or national security or national defense. The fact of the matter is the commercialization of space benefits both of those areas because lower launch costs benefit both civil space and the military. And frankly, the Trump administration has, I think, raised the international concern about the militarization of space with this talk of space dominance. Set aside the Space Force, which is kind of reorganization of the Air Force. There's been a consistent message from the Vice President about space dominance. And, you talk to people in Europe and they're looking at this and saying, well, does that mean they're going to dominate us? And I recently visited Japan and they're talking about, do they live in a world of space dominance by the United States? And certainly you've seen China's space program take enormous strides in the last 10 years. And so on one hand, we got this track of very positive civil space, but the militarization of space is something to definitely watch and be concerned about.
Jill, there's no regulation. While there are treaties, there's a treaty that prevents you from putting weapons of mass destruction on space or making a military base on the moon and so on. There's nothing that stops you exploiting space for conventional weapons systems, right?
Yes. So this is one of the arguments that I've been making for a long time, is that, well, one of the things that fascinates me about space is that I think it taps into the two extremes of our humanity, which is this beautiful, noble idea of exploring and cooperating and finding out who we are, and then also having this political, military, competitive high ground. And those two extremes, I think, are quite fascinating. It's interesting that you bring up the point about competition. One thing that I would point out, I've been researching in this area for a long time, and I think we tend to conflate different entities who are working in this area. So, you have people who are working on the science side and astronauts and cosmonauts, and they are often caught up with the funding and the politics of people who are working in a very different area. So just because two people are from the same country and have gotten mixed into the same discourse around something like space exploration doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same motivations. Right. And so it's difficult to disentangle those two, but I think it's worth recognizing that. Something else I would just point out, we've been talking about space exploration in general, tourism, colonization, but with regards to the Dragon and the docking that we had this weekend, something I would be curious about the rest of the panel's opinion is with regards to the International Space Station specifically. As Colonel Hadfield pointed out, this was a massive international collaborative project which brought together, for example, the Soviet Union, the Russians, and the Americans at a very tense time. What's going to happen with the International Space Station? Is it headed towards commercialization more generally, or do people think it's going to continue to be more of a government project?
All right, just in 10 seconds, a final quick one. Chris Hadfield, would you go back to space and do another performance for us, just in 10 seconds? If we get another, I don't know, Virgin Galactic commercial thing going.
I would love to fly on SpaceX's spaceship or Boeing's or anybody who'd give me a ride. It's a magnificent human experience. Fantastic. And the more people that can benefit from it, I think the better we'll all be.
All right, we'll look forward to another posting on YouTube before not too long of Colonel Hadfield. Maybe our other guests too, who knows? Maybe we'll all be up in space soon. I would say this discussion has been out of this world, but I don't want to get too cheesy on everyone. So let's thank our guests very much, Commander Chris Hadfield, Eric Berger, and Jill Stewart. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here now, it's goodbye.